Earthing technology, global warming and the biomimetics of technology in the Anthropocene. Now, what I would like to do today is to take a step back in this contribution and zoom a little bit out of biomimicry and biomimetic design, so that we are not focusing on design practice and all the issues involved there, but that we look at the role, function, but also the ambition of biomimetics from a broader societal perspective. That's what I want to do today. Normally, if we look at modern technological societies, we assume a stable and favorable climate that is presupposed in these type of societies. And that raises, of course, the question, how should we, as a society, attune our future technologies to the changing environment in which technologies operate and function, the times that we are experienced right now in terms of global warming. And the interesting, you can frame this time frame of global warming as the emergence of a new geological epoch or time frame, which is called the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene is a new geological epoch in which the human has become the most influential terraforming factor on Earth. Global warming is one of the main characteristics of the Anthropocene. And on the one hand, it shows our dependency on the carrying capacity of planet Earth for our human existence. But with this, on the other, it calls for the transition to a more sustainable future, including sustainable technologies. Now, the question is, how should we conceptualize these sustainable technologies in the Anthropocene? And my proposal is that we can frame and we can understand biomimetics as an eco-centric and ecosystem-friendly approach of technology that is a promising way forward to these future sustainable technologies. So let's focus first a little bit on these changed conditions of technology in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene can be defined as the epoch in which the geological conditions and processes of planet Earth are profoundly altered by human activity. Of course, one can argue that already in agriculture and Neolithicum, this emerged, but it is easy to understand that since the Industrial Revolution, it is increasingly the case that the whole planet is covered by human activity, so that we cannot think about the Earth without human interventions, and we cannot think about the human existence without its global habitation of the environment. So that means that in this, what is called Anthropocene, humankind and planet Earth become completely intertwined and dependent on each other. And the interesting thing is that while philosophers like Nietzsche had difficulty to convince that the Earth becomes humanized and the human becomes naturalized, we nowadays experience in this Anthropocene the truth of this basic insight. So the Anthropocene, in terms also of global warming as an intrinsic relation, an intrinsic characteristic of this time frame, makes us sensitive to the idea that we have to take responsibility for the sustainability of planet Earth. That means that it provides a new idea of stewardship because it overthrows classical dichotomies like nature versus culture, nature versus technology. And one of the founding fathers of the notion of the Anthropocene, Paul Crutzen, then is also in an explicit and literal sense talking about the situation that nature is us. And that leads to a critical, a relevant philosophical question. If the current phase of the Anthropocene demands a human stewardship of the earth in order to ensure the sustainability of the planet, while the Anthropocene, on the other hand, shows the immanence of thinking to the physical, what then is exactly the role of human agency in general and of human technology in particular? And it is, you should read this type of material yourself as well, I guess. But in the literature on the Anthropocene, there you find, by the engineers and by the scientists, you find framings that this new stewardship, for instance, needs to steer nature's core in a symbiotic way. For instance, again, Crutzen argues, in a way that grows with Earth's biological wealth instead of depleting it. The basic idea is that till the industrial, especially since the Industrial Revolution, the role of human technology is to exploit and deplete the natural environment. And we are looking for a new type of technologies, a new type of human stewardship that is more aligned with natural processes, that is symbiotic, as Crutzen argues, and grows, explores the biological wealth of nature. Now, these people are not talking about biomimicry or biomimetics, but you can argue that this, what they in fact call for, is biomimetic or biomimetic design. And this is also confirmed in philosophy. For instance, Peter Sloterdijk argues that contemporary technologies like biotech and synthetic biology are not purely natural or technological, but are rather hybrid technologies that are similar to nature. He's talking about homeotechnology, and homeo then means similar, alike. So the way our technologies function and deal with the environment is similar, alike how nature functions. And this is also what is found in the more hardcore or dark green versions of biomimetics, for instance, in Janine Benyus' idea of technological developments that imitate the operating principles of nature. For instance, the idea that nature runs on sunlight, or nature doesn't produce waste, and we can mimic these type of principles of nature in our technological design in order to generate sustainable technologies that can also guide our way, or guide us out of this global warming. Now, to the extent that biomimetic technology acts and performs in accordance with the operating principles of nature, it can claim to be such a symbiotic management approach to nature's course and to growth with Earth's biological wealth. So in this respect, we can argue that biomimicry is a model for future sustainable technology in the Anthropocene. But at the same time, and that provides a problem with the problem with anthropocentrism, at the same time, biomimicry is still understood often in anthropocentric way, namely as the manager, as the human, as the manager of planet Earth, And that is a little bit strange, because if nature is us, if these type of dichotomies are not valid anymore, then it is problematic to claim that the primary role of humans is to manage the planet. Again, just to refer to one of these authors in the Anthropocene discourse, like Crutzen, he is talking about good management. We should steer the environment in the right direction. Benjes is talking about technology that should solve human problems. Biomimetics focuses on human problems. And only humans, according to Sloterdijk, can guarantee a sustainable future. So here we are confronted with a paradox. On the one hand, human agency mimics nature's biological wealth, and on the other hand, nature is a patient that depends on good human management. Now, I have two fundamental issues or problems with this idea that you can find in the work of the philosophers and scientists I referred to. One could argue that the anthropocentrism presupposes a dualism between a strict dichotomy between humans on the one hand and the natural environment on the other hand, and that especially this dualism and this central role of humanity is the root cause of the exploitation of planet Earth since the Industrial Revolution that has led to what is now called the Anthropocene. And the second problem I have is that current findings in the Earth system sciences show that planet Earth is not an entity that is manageable or is able to get under control. And that is a little bit presupposed if you start from the idea of an anthropocentric human management role. So in this regard, I think that current approaches of biomimetics are insufficient to frame and to use the potential of biomimetics for future sustainable technology because of this anthropocentric orientation, and that we have to look for a more eco-centric orientation. And this is what I call earthing technology, namely biomimetic technology in the sense of the mimesis of the earth. And ecocentrism means that natural agency informs our concept of biomimetic technologies. And that's, so that is instead of the anthropos, so to speak. And that raises the question, what do we actually mean with nature or earth? Because what type of principles can we derive from nature or the earth that can be mimicked in these future technological design? And the starting point for my reflection is the philosophical insight that not only humans, but all agents, all beings have agency. And this is an idea that you can find already very early in the work of Spinoza. For instance, according to Spinoza, each thing, as far as it can by its own power, strives, conatus, to persevere in its own being. This idea stems from philosophers like Spinoza, but is also nowadays deeply acknowledged in both philosophical, for instance, new materialism, but also in the sciences. So let's explore a little bit this idea of conativity as a principle of nature that can maybe help us to develop an eco-centric understanding of biomimetic design. The interesting thing is that also philosophers of biomimicry, like Fry and Matthews, use this, refer to this notion of conativity. Yeah? Conatus is the will wherewith everything strives to persevere in its own existence. So conativity is the movement in which the identity of each and every material body on Earth is constituted. And that is not autopoiesis. This is not survival of the fittest, because that is already indicated by Spinoza. The conativity is not my will or the will of a thing or an entity, but the conatus, to preserve itself, is the very essence of a thing. So that means that conativity differentiates the identity of natural entities from undifferentiated materiality and prevent its relapse in this common substance. All natural entities, ranging from the stone, the tree, human beings, but also technologies, are modes or modifications of nature in which they strive for self-perseverance, in the double sense of constituting the self or identity of that being, and persevere in this being in its exposition to the environment. So the first characteristic of nature or Earth that we can derive is the principle of conativity, which consists in the articulation and establishment of the self or the identity of natural entities as differentiations from undifferentiated nature. And then biomimicry means to mimic this principle of nature in technological design. Biomimetic technologies then incorporate the self-perseverance and self-perseverance, so the self-constitution and the self-maintenance of nature, in which the self or identity or of natural technological hybrids is constituted. And this is a critical issue because biomimetic practices often limit themselves to the mimicking of the form or the function of a natural entity, while this enables us to focus much more on the mimesis of the self-organization, self-design, self-regulation, and self-healing of natural entities in technological design. But this implies, if we focus on an eco-centric orientation of biomimetics, this implies that biomimetic technologies are no longer instruments in the hand of human control, but that their agency involves uncertainty and unpredictability. That's another key issue here, that we tend to believe that biomimetic design is just copying or mimicking or is inspired by natural design, but an eco-centric orientation doesn't allow this control anymore. Now, if conativity is a differentiation of the self or identity of natural beings, nature itself is undifferentiated matter or non-identity. We can compare this with a classical dichotomy between chaos, so the non-identity or undifferentiated nature, and order as differentiated nature. And conativity constitutes this transition from undifferentiated nature to differentiated nature, which then means that nature itself always remains heterogeneous to and always transcends the differentiated nature that we encounter in the world. And also this dualist notion of nature implies a very important finding that we can confront with contemporary understandings of biomimetics, because it involves the fundamental limitation of any biomimetics. nature is always heterogeneous. Nature remains the terra incognita. And that means that this heterogeneous nature will always put a limit to our effort to mimic it in technological design. It also provides the advantage that we now can understand such an eco-centric understanding of biomimetics, enables us to acknowledge failure. Why do some biomimetic designs fail? It is possible to have missteps, misuse, controversy, and it also prevents a little bit of a naive understanding of biomimetics that you can find, for instance, in the work of Janine Benyus, but also Freya Matthews and Henry Dix, that biomimetics seems to be something intrinsically or even ethically good. And that's just not true. That's just not true. Nature remains heterogeneous, and that means that it always involves a limit to our technological design, and that our technological design can always fail, even if it pretends to mimic the natural environment. I think this is also a very important contribution to this also a sort of reality check that we need if we talk about biomimetic design. A third aspect of nature or the earth as the providing principle of biomimetic design is that nature is not only conative, it is not only differentiating the self or the identity of natural entities, but it's also associative. So on the one hand, the self is constituted by this conativity, but as this constituted differentiated nature, it is also responsive to the environment, and this environment is also mutually responsive to each other. So conativity articulates natural entities as modes of nature that are at the same time responsive to other conative entities. And these mutual responsive entities constitute the ecosystems of planet Earth. And also here we find a critical issue with regard to biomimetic design, because if biomimetic design, so technological design, is eco-centric, then it is not only mimicking the principle of conativity, but also this principle of responsiveness. And that enables us to reject the current practice that we see quite often, that biomimetics is limited to the mimicking or the inspiration taken from a natural form or function, and to highlight the necessity to move beyond the mimicking of form and function towards regenerative design, which is responsive to the ecosystem in which it is embedded and on which it depends. So through the conative responsiveness of biomimetic design, biomimetic technologies can in fact claim to be sustainable, because they are not merely mimicking form or function, but are regenerative by design. So to conclude, what I tried to do in this short presentation is to take a step back, not focusing too much on the daily practice of biomimetic design, and to consider it in the context of global warming in the Anthropocene. I've shown that the Anthropocene unsettles self-evident dichotomies like nature, technology, and call for sustainable design. And I've shown that in principle, biomimetic design is such a model, can function and can have the ambition to be such a model for sustainable technology. The problem, however, is, or one of the problems, there are of course more, one of the problems here is that the the implicit or explicit anthropocentrism in the current thinking, both with regard to the Anthropocene and the biomimetic design, which I have proposed a solution by the replacement of this anthropocentrism by ecocentrism, an eco-centric concept of biomimetic technology. I have tried to introduce very briefly, you can read this I've extensively reflected on this in the article, 3 principles of a non-anthropocentric, non-dualist and ecocentric concept of nature that can inspire an ecocentric concept of biomimetic technologies. These principles can guide future technological development in the Anthropocene. And then if we use this inspiration from the earthing of technology, biomimicry is not primarily bio-inspiration and also not mimicking a natural form or function, but is mimicking the conative responsiveness of nature in regenerative design. And as such, it holds the promise of being a genuine sustainable technology. I thank you very much for your attention. The article can be read if you look at my website, and it can also be found in ResearchGate and other social media.